Hello and welcome to the Developing Skills for Everyday Life. My name is Chris Bond. I'm one of the occupational therapists in the Worcestershire Children's Occupational Therapy Service. And today we're going to go through some training about how to develop skills with children and young people. So who is this training for? This training is aimed at giving parents, carers or teachers some tips and strategies for developing or teaching children with daily living skills. We particularly aim this at children with some additional learning needs that might mean that learning a new skill is more of a challenge. So for example, if a child has some delayed skills or delayed speech, or they might be on the neurodevelopmental spectrum, so with ASD or ADHD. So we're going to start off just thinking about independence. What is it? And there's a tendency for people to think independence is an all or nothing thing. That means that either you can do something or you can't. And sometimes we hear parents or carers say they'll never be independent in that. That can be quite a negative thought, and that can stop development or attempting to learn new skills. So you think if they're never going to be independent, why try and practice it? But we find it's more helpful to see independence on a sliding scale. If you look at the bottom of the slide, you can see you've got a scale from a child being fully dependent, that is a parent or carer does all of the task, to over the other side to a child being fully independent, so that is they're doing all parts of the task themselves. And you can see in between that you've got different grades of how much a child does in that. So you can see as their independence is increasing, they're doing more of the task. So some children with disabilities might not be fully independent in some tasks. However, it is very likely that over time they'll be able to grow in independence at least parts of the task over time. And you might find this surprise you by going on to completing the full task over time if you are making a concerted effort to help them to learn it. Achieving great levels of independence is well known to be really good for self-esteem, confidence and emotional well-being. So if you've got a child that is struggling to manage behaviour, this can be a really positive thing too. And it's also quite positive for children with sensory sensitivities. So we also have some training about managing sensory sensitivities. And there's some overlap with that. So this approach I'd also be encouraging if you have a child that is struggling with that too. So how does your child best learn? Everyone has their own way of learning new things, sometimes known as learning style. You might have heard that term before. It can be helpful just to reflect on your own learning style and think about something that was new to you and how you learnt it. How did you do that? I always think it's telling if you have one of those kind of flat pack furnitures like from IKEA with that instruction sheet that comes with it. How do you figure out what you need to do? Do you study the instructions first? Do you dive in and try and assemble it yourself and figure it out on the go? If you watch someone else do it first, or do you listen to someone talking through the task? That gives you a clue about what kind of learner you are. Think about how your child best learns and what their level of understanding is. Like they might have additional communication needs or approaches to aid their communication. So for example, some children might use something called PECS, which is a picture exchange system, where it involves picture cards. They may use photo cards, objects of reference, signing, using gesture, or they may just use simplified language. That can give you some clues about how to teach them. So for example, if they're using PECS or photo cards, you might include some picture cards to help them understand parts of the tasks so that they can follow that. Find a task they're motivated to learn. So we all have our own motivations, and if it's something that you're not motivated by, it's going to be quite difficult for you to learn it because it's going to be a bit of a slog. So ideally try and find something the child wants to learn. However, sometimes some tasks people may not be motivated to learn, but actually they're needed for daily life. So for example, things like dressing, you need to do that for school and daily life. So those kind of things that your child may not be motivated by. Have a think about a reward chart or something that's motivating that will motivate them to kind of practice that skill. Breaking a task down. So lots of these approaches involve what we call a task breakdown. This is where you get the task and you break it down into smaller mini tasks. That makes it easier to learn. So how small you break down a task will depend on how hard it is for the child. So if you have something that's very complicated, you generally break it down into much smaller amounts. It's quite an easy task. You might have less steps in it. So if we think about some examples that make it a bit clearer. So for example, putting on a t-shirt, you could break that into step 1, picking up the t-shirt by the waist end. Step 2, pulling it over your head. Step 3, pushing your head through the neck hole. Step 4, push one arm through an armhole. Step 5, push the other arm through an armhole. And step 6, ensuring the t-shirt is pulled down so that it covers up your top half. Likewise, brushing teeth can be broken down into picking up the toothpaste, opening the cap on the toothpaste, squeeze the toothpaste onto a toothbrush, brush your back teeth, brush the side of your teeth, brush the inside edge of your teeth, brush the front of your teeth, spit out any toothpaste, rinse your toothbrush, and then put the cap back on the toothpaste. You might notice in that example that you might need to break down some of those steps a little bit further. So for example, step number 4, brushing your back teeth. You've actually got a few different sets of back teeth, so you might need to break that down into kind of left side, right side, the back teeth on the top, back teeth on the bottom, things like that. You might have also noticed that you might do the task in a different order to the one that I've written. And that's okay. We all do things slightly different, but try and think about the order that your child naturally goes for, and try and focus on that as your task breakdown. The approach that we most often use is something called backward chaining. So that's where the task breakdown, if you think about where you start, you have a choice. You can either start at step number 1, which would seem to be like the logical place to start, or you could start towards the end. So if you start towards the end, we call that backward chaining. And if you start at the start of the task breakdown, that's called forward chaining. Now, backward chaining has some great advantages. So the good thing about it is you can very quickly get some kind of success. So you only need to do 1 or 2 steps and then the task is completed, which gives you a really good sense of success in it. And that can build on motivation to try other steps in future. Also, it's very quick. So if your child struggles to maintain their attention and concentration, this is a great approach to do because they only have to maintain it for those few steps. So for example, if we think back to the t-shirt dressing example, you would start towards the end. So you might start just pulling it down once you've got your neck and arms through, or you might start on just the last arm, pushing that through and then pulling the top down. So some tips with backward chaining. So try and practice each step until they've shown that your child can consistently complete that step over time. Once they can consistently do that, then go back a step. So go back to the step before where you last started. So in our last example, you might go back to step 4. Once they've achieved that, then go back to step 3. So each time they're doing more and more steps once they've achieved that. And do that until they've learnt the whole task over time. Try and be consistent, so do the task the same way each time because that's going to help your child's learning. And that's especially important if there's more than one adult supporting that child. So if you've got both parents helping or a carer or teacher supporting the child, then consistency is really important. Okay, forward chaining. This is probably the way that you naturally think of when breaking a task down. However, it can be harder to learn that than the backward chaining, as it doesn't have the same advantages that backward chaining has. So you have to remember all the steps from the start, and you've got longer before you achieve some kind of success with the task. So for example, with our t-shirt dressing example, you'd start at step number 1, and then you go on to step 2 until you've achieved them all. Some children actually learn that way, but if you find that this way doesn't work very well, try the backward chaining instead. Okay, some thoughts on levels of prompting. There are different types of prompting. So some allow more independence or offer more guidance than others, and some allow more independence. So some examples are like visual prompting. So that might be where you show a picture instruction or might demonstrate the step next to the child so they can watch visually. It might be a gestural prompt, so it might involve you pointing or showing the action with some movement for the next step. It might involve a verbal prompt, so some simple verbal commands on what step to do next. It might involve some hand over hand, which is a very useful technique where you'd stand behind a child and you would guide their hands or their body to complete that part of the task. So they get to understand the sense of the movement that's needed for that. So for example, with learning to use a knife and fork, you might stand behind a child, you might guide their hands with the movements that are required so they get to understand the order of that. Over time, as your child learns the task, see if you can offer less dependent prompts. So for example, if you're using hand over hand prompting, see of the time that you can step back to using a gestural prompt or a photo prompt instead, because that allows them to be more independent and they're less reliant on you. Photo task breakdowns. This can be helpful in learning tasks, and we're going to spend a bit of time just thinking about how to do this. It can be really helpful visual prompts that might mean that a child doesn't have to rely on you as much because they've got a photo chart that they can follow. So it helps them to be more independent in that. It's also a helpful reminder for a young person with a more complicated task. So for example, if they're working on making a snack independently, it helps them to remember all of the different steps without having to retain all that in their memory, because instead you have a photo record of it which you can follow. It does need to be meaningful, so the child needs to understand the photos. Think about if they have any communication difficulties, are they able to understand the meaning of the photos? Also think about how many steps can they cope with at one time. So too many steps on a page might be too confusing for some children. Other children can manage that okay. Think about whether you use real photos versus kind of clip art kind of pictures. Some children need a real photo. You might find some children need a real photo of them doing the task to remind themselves what that involves. Can they read at all? If they can, you might have some simple writing on there. If they can't read, then you would avoid kind of any written information on there and you try and make it as pictorial as possible. Now we have some examples of photo task breakdowns. So we've got two on the screen there. The picture on the left would just be a simple photo card with just one photo of a task step on there. And so typically you just kind of laminate a photo of a task step. They might just have one photo per page, and you could organise it, say for example on a key ring. So a child would only have to look at one task step and then flip the photo over to the next one and follow it like that. If the child's able to read, you might have additional written information next to the photo or underneath, and then you could do it again as a key ring, or you can make a simple booklet, or you could organise the photos on a Velcro strip. So as I just mentioned, another way of doing it is with a Velcro strip. So you can have simple laminated photos, one picture per each task step, and put Velcro on the back of that picture and stick them in order on a strip of Velcro. Now this approach sometimes might hear it referred to as the teach approach, which came from special schools in America, but you will often see this in place in special schools in the UK. It's quite a common approach that's used. And as each step is completed, typically you would remove the photo from the Velcro and you put it in a box to indicate that it's been done or completed, so it's out of sight. And then you'll go down to the next picture that you can see in the sequence to do that. Just need to take care with this to make sure the number of steps doesn't overwhelm your child, so it's just right for them. So if you have too many steps on there, it might be too much. Sometimes just having 3 or 4 at a time might be enough, but gauge what your child's able to cope with. Okay, monitoring your child's progress. It can be handy to monitor child's progress over time because that will tell you how successful it's been in learning that skill. It can also encourage consistency amongst people working with the child. So if you've got more than one parent doing it, Or if you've got lots of different environments, so some children might access respite care, school and home, so you've got 3 different environments, and it can help to ensure that everyone does the task the same way, which is going to help the child to learn it. So just on the page there, you've got 2 examples just of monitoring forms that I've used as noted in the past. One just a simple one of the task breakdown, what kind of support they need. So for example, what kind of prompting you might give, might be a visual prompt, verbal prompt, and whether they've achieved that step independently yet. And the one below just breaks down what kind of prompting you're giving at each stage to see whether over time you're giving less prompting, so they're becoming more independent. So some general tips. So if your child has some delay in their language skills, try and be more visual and less verbal. So you want as visual a way as possible. Demonstration is great, so demonstrating as a parent or doing it together as a whole family, so that a child or young person can see everyone in the house brushing their teeth and learn from that. Do it in parallel, so that is where you do the task alongside. So with teeth brushing, you might be brushing your teeth at the same time as your child is brushing theirs. So they can actively see, and they gain some prompting by watching you do the different stages of the task. Do things in front of a mirror where possible, because that allows for more visual feedback, particularly if you've got someone with delayed motor skills, then they can just check what their body's doing in space and where their hand is, and it coordinates them a little bit better. You can try watching some YouTube videos of tasks first, and there's lots of different videos on YouTube of various different tasks that's sometimes helpful. Using hand over hand, particularly good if a child is struggling with the sense of the movement. So as I mentioned earlier, so things like cutlery, sometimes doing up buttons to get the sense of how you get the button through the buttonhole, can be handy to do that hand over hand so they can get the sense of that movement. And try a photo task breakdown. Some more tips. Undressing is easier than dressing, so quite often it's easier to practice undressing first. Once they've got that, they move on to dressing. Loose fitting clothing is easier to manage than tight fitting clothing, so nice baggy tracksuit bottoms and t-shirts or pyjamas are really good places to start with kind of learning to dress. Try tighter fitting clothes once the child is confident in putting on loose fitting clothes. As I mentioned earlier, try to be consistent as possible with the dressing tasks. So encourage your child to start with the same side of the body each time as well. Leave it extra time so your child doesn't feel rushed. So before school in the morning might not be the best time to learn a skill, but for dressing you might want to focus more on the weekend, or once a child's come in from school, changing from school clothes into non-school clothes might be an idea, or changing into pyjamas. Try to work on dressing in the same location, because that can help the learning process. And try and minimise distractions and interruptions. So think about things like music, TV, any kind of screens. Try and minimise all of those. Remember to end each session with lots of praise for your child's efforts. So you want to give it as much praise as possible to really encourage their learning and giving it a go. If a child has a physical disability and isn't able to complete part of the task, there may be ways to adapt a task so that it's still possible, and an occupational therapist can give you advice on how to do that. Lastly, if you'd like any further support or information, we have lots of universal advice and tips available on our website, and the details are there. We also have lots of other YouTube videos available on the Worcestershire Children's Therapy Services YouTube channel. And we have our own Facebook group, and we also currently run an advice line twice a week for children that are based in Worcestershire, and the details are there. Thanks.